in Roman history that you might not know too much about, the Batavian Revolt. This was a dramatic rebellion that took place in 69 to 70 CE, led by a guy named Julius Civilis, who took on the mighty Roman Empire with his Batavian people. At first, it seemed like they might actually win, but in the end, they were defeated by a Roman general named Quintus Putius Cerealis. But let's rewind and set the stage a little bit. So, here's what was going on in the Roman Empire at the time. About 100 years earlier, Augustus, the first emperor, had transformed the Roman Republic into a full-blown monarchy. People had gotten used to having one guy in charge. And for the most part, it worked, as long as that guy wasn't totally terrible. When the emperor was someone competent, like Augustus himself, or even Tiberius and Claudius, things ran relatively smoothly. But then along came Nero. Yeah, Nero, not exactly a great ruler. While things were peaceful and prosperous for a while during his reign, he eventually started acting more like a tyrant, and that's when the cracks in the empire started to show. One of the first to stand up to Nero's increasingly despotic rule was a guy named Gaius Julius Vindex, a senator and governor from Gaul, modern-day France. He wasn't just a random rebel. He wanted to change things through official channels, and even found a replacement for Nero, a man named Servius Sulpicius Galba, who was governing in Spain at the time. But Vindex's rebellion didn't go well. He couldn't rally enough support, and his forces were crushed by Lucius Virginius Rufus, the Roman commander of the legions in Germania Superior. Vindex himself didn't survive the fight. Meanwhile, Nero was in full-on panic mode, and in June 68 CE, after facing more resistance, he ultimately took his own life. Galba was declared emperor by the Senate, but let's just say his reign wasn't exactly smooth sailing. The legions stationed along the Rhine weren't too thrilled with Galba. They had fought hard to put down Vindex's revolt, but instead of getting praise, they felt like they were being punished. Their commanders were replaced, and on top of that, Galba dismissed the Batavian cavalry who had been the emperor's personal guards. Ouch! By early 69 CE, things were really starting to boil over. The soldiers in Germania Inferior decided they'd had enough and declared their commander, Aulus Vitellius, as emperor. But Galba couldn't handle the pressure. He was killed by his own Praetorian Guard, and a senator named Otho took over as emperor. But as you can probably guess, this didn't last long either. Vitellius' army crushed Otho's forces, and after losing a major battle, Otho took his own life too. Now Vitellius was emperor, but he had a big problem. He had taken most of his troops with him to Italy, leaving the Rhine frontier dangerously underdefended. This is where our man, Julius Civilis, steps into the story. He was a Batavian noble who had served in the Roman army and even fought in Britain. He had also been imprisoned by the Romans under suspicion of treason, though he had been released thanks to political maneuvering. Civilis saw an opportunity. With Vitellius's troops stretched thin, he decided it was time for the Batavians to rise up. But why were the Batavians so upset? Well, for one, they were being heavily conscripted into the Roman military, and the process was incredibly corrupt. Recruiting officers were demanding bribes and taking old or unfit men into the army just to make a quick buck, while the young and strong were often mistreated or sent off to satisfy the officers' personal desires. This abuse stirred up a lot of anger among the Batavians. Civilis took advantage of this growing resentment and called together the leaders of the Batavian community for a secret meeting in a sacred grove. Over food and drink, with emotions running high, he laid it all out. The Batavians were no longer treated as partners of Rome, but as slaves. He reminded them of their people's glory and pushed them to rise up against the Romans. And now let's dive deeper into what really sparked the Batavian Revolt. You might be thinking, sure, they were fed up with being forced into the Roman army and had a leader with a personal vendetta, but there's more to the story than just those two reasons. If the Batavians were genuinely happy under Roman rule, they probably would have just shrugged off the forced recruitment as a temporary annoyance. So, what else was brewing beneath the surface? Let's break it down. First off, Julius Civilis had some serious personal motivations driving him. Tacitus, the Roman historian, mentions that Civilis's brother, Paulus, was executed, possibly unjustly. Imagine losing a sibling like that. It's enough to fuel anyone's desire for revenge. On top of that, Civilis came from a prominent Batavian family with royal roots. His ancestors had been kings, and even though the political landscape had changed, the idea of restoring royal power might have been lingering in his mind. While Tacitus doesn't explicitly state this, it's a plausible motive given Civilis's background. But Civilis wasn't acting alone. According to Tacitus, he gave a speech where he highlighted the corrupt recruitment practices of the Romans, arguing that the Batavians were no longer seen as allies but as mere subjects. Whether or not Civilis actually said those exact words is up for debate, but the sentiment was clear. The Batavians felt deeply disrespected and exploited. The heavy conscription was a major burden. Every Batavian family had at least one son in the army, and Vitellius was pushing them too hard. This widespread resentment definitely played a significant role in pushing the Batavians to revolt. Another layer to this is the idea of freedom. Tacitus often portrays barbarian leaders like Civilis as fighting for the freedom of their people. But what does freedom really mean in this context? Were the Batavians seeking true independence and autonomy, or was Civilis more interested in empowering the Batavian elite? There's some evidence to suggest the latter. The older Batavian aristocracy, who had been granted Roman citizenship generations ago, might have been clashing with a newer generation of Batavians who were gaining influence under different Roman emperors. This internal tension could have been a factor in the rebellion, with Civilis possibly aiming to restore the rights of the old aristocracy. Religion might have also played a role. There was a Bructurian prophetess named Valletta who predicted the Batavians' victory. While it's unclear whether she actively incited the rebellion or simply foretold its success, her influence cannot be ignored. Religious leaders often played pivotal roles in uniting and motivating people during such tumultuous times. Interestingly, the Batavian Revolt wasn't sparked by the typical financial grievances we see in other rebellions of that era, like Boudicca's Uprising in Britain or the Jewish Revolt in Judea. Instead, it was more about the oppressive recruitment and the broader sense of injustice. This makes the Batavian Revolt unique among the rebellions of the first century. So, what brought all these factors together? It was a mix of personal vendettas, internal political struggles, and widespread resentment over harsh recruitment practices. Civilis wasn't just fighting against Roman oppression, he was also navigating the complex dynamics within his own tribe. Now, let's move on to how Civilis actually ignited the revolt. At this point, Civilis was still commanding one of the Batavian auxiliary units in the Roman army, and the Roman commander of the Rhine army, Marcus Hordonius Flaccus, didn't know about Civilis's plans. This situation gave Civilis the perfect opportunity to strike. He convinced the Canaanefates, a neighboring tribe, to join the rebellion, hoping that Flaccus would send him to quell the uprising. And that's exactly how things started to heat up in August of 69 CE. One of the key players in this initial attack was a guy named Breno from the Canaanefates. He was a bit of a hotshot, coming from a distinguished family and eager to prove himself. Breno rallied the Frisians, another local tribe, and launched a surprise attack on 2 Roman auxiliary units near the North Sea. The Roman garrisons weren't expecting it and were quickly overwhelmed, leading to the sacking of their posts and chaos among the Roman supply lines. Archaeological evidence supports Tacitus's account of these early victories. For example, at Praetorium Agrippinae, now modern Valkenburg near Leiden, archaeologists found signs of burning, indicating that the Romans had indeed been attacked and defeated there. Another site, Trajectum, now modern Utrecht, also shows evidence of destruction, including a treasure of 50 gold pieces buried by a Roman officer who never got his money back. Despite these early successes, the Batavian forces were still relatively weak on paper. Most of the Roman legions had been pulled away, leaving only a small number of soldiers to defend the Rhine frontier. This scarcity of troops made it easier for Civilis and his allies to gain ground quickly. A senior centurion named Aquilius tried to rally the remaining forces, but his army lacked the strength to mount a sustained defense. Civilis then used a clever trick to consolidate his power. He criticized the Roman commanders for abandoning their forts and offered to handle the rebellion himself, hoping to gain their trust and draw them into a trap. However, the Germanic tribes are known for their fierce fighting spirit, and it didn't take long for rumors of Civilis's true intentions to spread. Before long, it became clear that Civilis was the mastermind behind the uprising, not just a leader fighting for freedom. With the rebellion gaining momentum, Civilis enlisted support from other tribes, including the Tungrians. Their defection was a significant blow to the Romans, who found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The rebels managed to defeat a Roman force of about 6,500 men, which included both legionaries and auxiliary troops. This victory not only avenged Civilis's brother, but also established the Batavians as the dominant tribe in the region. At this point, Civilis thought he had achieved everything he set out to do. He had secured freedom for the Batavians and believed that the Romans would recognize their independence, especially with support from Vespasian, who was leading a revolt against Emperor Vitellius in Judea. However, Civilis's confidence would soon lead to his downfall. And, as we discussed earlier, Julius Civilis and the Batavians had gotten pretty much everything they were after: recognition of their independence from Rome, vengeance for the heavy-handed Roman recruitment practices, and justice for the death of Civilis' brother. They'd secured a lot of wins, but there was one line they shouldn't cross, one thing they absolutely had to avoid: attacking the Roman legionary base at Xanten. You see, that base was more than just a military outpost, it was a symbol of Roman power. No emperor could tolerate an attack on it, and if so much as one spear was thrown over its walls, Rome would retaliate hard. Now, Civilis wasn't some naive rebel. He'd served in the Roman military as an auxiliary officer and was a Roman citizen himself. He knew what the consequences would be. In fact, everyone knew. Just a few years earlier, the Jews had attacked the 12th Legion, and the Romans responded with brutal force. Civilis must have known this was the likely outcome. Yet, despite all of that, at the end of September in 69 CE, Civilis and the Batavians made the bold move of attacking Xanten, Vetra as it was known back then. The timing. It was almost perfect. 2 weeks earlier, the legions from the Danube had pledged their support to Vespasian, and now, with the civil war raging in Italy, any Roman response to the attack would likely be delayed. Civilis even dyed his hair red and vowed not to cut it until he'd wiped out the 2 Roman legions stationed there. It was like signing his own death warrant. But Civilis wasn't acting recklessly, he was prepared. He had the help of 8 auxiliary units that had once fought for Vitellius in Italy. These were battle-hardened men, veterans from campaigns in Britain and Gaul, who had recently been redirected to the Rhine. Convincing them to side with the Batavian cause wasn't too difficult. At first, Rome's response to Civilis' growing revolt was sluggish. The commander of the Roman forces in Germania, Marcus Hordonius Flaccus, had a chance to put down the rebellion early by intercepting those auxiliary units. But instead of taking decisive action, Flaccus hesitated. He worried that his troops were too green and that engaging the well-trained Batavian units could be too risky. And maybe, just maybe, Flaccus had a bigger picture in mind. Germania Inferior, the region where this revolt was taking place, wasn't exactly critical to the empire. Other regions like Germania Superior and Gallia Belgica were far more valuable. Flaccus might have been gambling that by allowing the rebellion to simmer in the north, it would stay localized and wouldn't threaten the core Roman interests. It was a risky strategy, but on paper it made sense. Flaccus wanted to protect the key Roman strongholds like Mainz and, if possible, hold on to Xanten. and his decision to bide his time depended on the outcome of the larger civil war happening between Vitellius and Vespasian. But all that meant one thing: the soldiers trapped in Xanten were left to fend for themselves. Civilis, aware of Roman strength, didn't immediately launch a full-scale assault. Instead, he sent a message to the 2 Roman legions stationed at Xanten, urging them to pledge their loyalty to Vespasian, whom Civilis claimed to support. But the Romans were defiant. They rejected his offer, calling him a traitor and vowing to remain loyal to Vitellius. That rejection enraged Civilis, and he rallied not just his Batavians but other Germanic tribes like the Bructeri and Tencteri. Word spread, and soon the entire region of Germania was buzzing with anticipation of plunder and glory. With his forces swelled by reinforcements, Civilis laid siege to Xanten. The Romans inside were outnumbered, about 5,000 men against a much larger force. But they had a well-fortified camp, and Civilis' initial attempts to storm the walls were unsuccessful. The Batavians tried building siege works, but they didn't have the technical know-how to pull it off effectively. Civilis then decided to play the long game, aiming to starve the Romans into submission. Meanwhile, the Batavian leader sent raiding parties across Germania Inferior and Gallia Belgica. The plundering was vicious, particularly against tribes that had Roman sympathies, like the Ubians, who had once been proud Germans but had since embraced Roman ways. At this point, the northern part of the Roman Empire was in utter chaos. On the Roman side, despite being stretched thin, Flaccus was preparing for a counterattack. He sent for reinforcements from Gaul, Spain, and Britain, and mobilized the 22nd Legion under the command of Gaius Dilius Vocula. The Romans knew they couldn't let Xanten fall, but Civilis wasn't going to sit around and wait for them. He understood the strategic importance of the army gathering at Krefeld and realized he had to strike first if his revolt was to succeed. The battle that followed was brutal. So, the year 70 CE started with a sense of hope for Rome. The brutal civil war was finally over, Vitellius had been eliminated, and the new emperor, Vespasian, seemed like a decent guy, kind, practical, and ready to set things straight. He had big plans too, ending the Jewish war and shutting down the Batavian Revolt in the northern provinces. But, well, things didn't go exactly as planned. You see, by the time Roman reinforcements arrived up north to calm the chaos brewing beyond the Alps, they were already too late. The situation had spiraled. Marcus Hordonius Flaccus, the Roman general who had briefly restored order in key towns like Cologne and Bonn, had been murdered by his own men. Yeah, you heard that right. His own soldiers turned on him. And just like that, the rebels, led by Julius Civilis, felt empowered again. They weren't just lying low anymore. They went back on the offensive, laying siege to the legions stuck at Xanten. Now here's where things get even more complicated. The Treverans and Lingones, 2 heavily Romanized Gallic tribes, also decided to join the revolt. These tribes had a long history of cooperation with Rome, but they were fed up and saw an opportunity for their own independence. So they launched a rebellion alongside Civilis, even though their goals were a bit different. Civilis was fighting for Batavian independence, but the Treverans and Lingones had something else in mind. They wanted to start a Gallic empire of their own. At this point, Rome's legions were spread too thin. A few small victories, like temporarily lifting the siege of Xanten, weren't enough to stop the rising tide of rebellion. Clausicus, a leader of the Treverans, made things even worse by turning traitor. This guy wasn't just any commander. He came from a line of Gallic kings, and he liked to brag that his ancestors were enemies of Rome rather than allies. He, along with other leaders like Julius Tutor and Julius Sabinus, who claimed some pretty wild things, like being descended from Julius Caesar's lover, were all in on the plot to overthrow Roman control. And it worked. These rebel leaders convinced Roman soldiers, yes, actual Roman soldiers, to switch sides. Can you imagine that? Roman legions, swearing allegiance not to the emperor, but to this Gallic empire that Sabinus was setting up. It was a mess. Vocula, the Roman general in charge, was betrayed and murdered, leaving the rebels in an even stronger position. With Vocula out of the way, Julius Civilis had full control of the region. He besieged Xanten, where the Roman 5th and 15th legions were stuck. The soldiers inside the city were running out of food. They'd already eaten their horses, mules, and anything else they could find, even grass. Desperate, they surrendered. But Civilis, well, he wasn't exactly merciful. After the soldiers swore allegiance to the Gallic Empire, they were ambushed and slaughtered during their march out of the city. The survivors were burned alive when their camp was set on fire. Civilis claimed it wasn't his fault, that it was the Germans who had broken faith, but it's hard to say if he was being honest or just covering for his own brutality. From there, Civilis moved to Cologne. Now, here's an interesting twist. Despite all the bloodshed, Civilis spared the city. Why? Well, his son had once been saved by the people of Cologne when the Romans wanted him dead, so he felt a debt of gratitude. Instead of looting the city, he made it his headquarters, even minting coins to celebrate his victories over the Romans. It looked like Civilis was on top of the world. But things were starting to change. The Romans weren't going to sit back and let this rebellion go unpunished. Enter Quintus Petius Cerealis, a seasoned general and a relative of Emperor Vespasian. Cerealis wasn't messing around. He marched north with a formidable force, including several battle-hardened legions. Civilis, who had been fighting with the help of local tribes, was about to face the full might of the Roman Empire. Cerealis started by targeting Trier, a major city controlled by the rebels. The Treverans tried to stop the Roman advance, but Cerealis crushed them near Rigodulum. He then marched into Trier and showed surprising clemency, punishing only the leaders of the revolt while sparing the rank-and-file soldiers and citizens. This was a turning point. Roman tactics and discipline were beginning to tip the balance back in favor of the empire. Civilis and his allies, Julius Tutor and Julius Classicus, decided to make one last-ditch effort to defeat the Romans. They launched a surprise attack on Cerealis' camp at Trier, hoping to catch the Romans off guard. And at first, it worked. The rebels penetrated the Roman defenses, but the legions fought back fiercely. By morning, the rebels had been driven out, their final hope of victory shattered. Meanwhile, in Cologne, things were falling apart for Civilis. The locals rose up and killed the Frisian and Chauci allies that Civilis had sent to suppress them. The rebellion was unraveling. Civilis was forced to retreat north, back to his homeland in the Batavian territories. To make matters worse, Roman reinforcements were pouring in from Britain and Hispania. Civilis knew the end was near, but he wasn't done fighting yet. Despite one last victory, when the Cananefates destroyed part of the Roman navy, Civilis' power was crumbling. By the time the 14th Legion landed in Belgica, the writing was on the wall. The Romans were coming, and this time, they weren't going to stop until the rebellion was crushed for good.